How do you know if you're activating your glutes correctly when you're running? Maybe you've heard the term lazy glute syndrome. In this video, I'm going to show you how you can fix your lazy glutes and use them to your advantage when you're running. When I say the word glutes, I'm really referring to gluteus maximus. Gluteus medius is an important stability muscle, but it's not our powerhouse muscle. It's our hip stability muscle. So in terms of powerhouse, moving our momentum forward, I'm talking about the gluteus maximus, that beefy butt muscle that you have right on the back side. A lot of the time runners will say that their glute's inhibited and it can't function correctly, but the truth is, unless you've had a stroke or a traumatic injury, if you can squeeze your glute muscles together and clench your butt cheeks, then your glutes can activate. Compensations, if your glutes are not being activated correctly, include that lumbar spine or that low back will hyperextend, because normally when the glute is not being activated enough, it doesn't have as much hip mobility. So if your hip normally needs about 10 to 20 degrees of hip extension during the push-off cycle, and that trunk should be pretty upright, posture's nice and tall, that's when your glute's going to be activated 100% as much as it can, determining what your strength level is. But if your hip is only into about 5 degrees of hip extension, you don't have that full hip mobility in order to push off correctly, then your glute's not going to be firing as much as it should. Now, one compensation that occurs when your hip doesn't get into as much hip mobility is your lumbar spine will hyperextend like this. So now it looks like my hip is getting into more hip mobility backwards, but it's really just extra motion from my lumbar spine. If you have low back pain or soreness just when running, take a look at your hip mobility, because it could be that you're compensating with that lumbar spine to get your hip into extension. Okay, so the first thing you need to look at is your hip mobility. If you don't have enough mobility, you're not going to be able to strengthen in that full range. So how do you check to make sure your glutes are being activated correctly when you're running? The first thing I have my patients do is do this box squat. So take a box, or you can even use a chair or a wall, and you're going to put your feet right up to that box. From here, I want you to squat down as far as you can. If when you squat, the first thing you do is shove your knees forward, that means you're not getting into that proper hip hinge that you need to activate your glutes correctly. Okay, so hands on your hips. And this is just a drill to work on that glute power. This is not necessarily how you should be squatting. Okay, so hands on your hips, feet against the block or wall, and as you squat down, your butt goes back. Okay, so my knees aren't going forward as much, and this is more of that hip hinge backwards. Mastering that hip hinge will ensure that you're using your glutes correctly and your lumbar spine is being nice and supportive as you go into that hip hinge. Okay, so this is the first one that I want you to practice, is that box squat. Down and up, you can do 2 sets of 10, and it's just to make sure that you understand the hip hinge and your body understands that movement pattern. Now, if that exercise is really difficult for you to do and you can't get down as low, I want you to try this exercise here. So take a block or a chair, and you're going to put one foot on it, and we'll do both sides. Hands on your hips, and I just want you to squeeze that butt cheek of the leg that's on the ground. Okay, so when I say squeeze, I want you to just clench that butt muscle. You can put your hand on your glutes and actually feel yourself clenching, and that's a great way to know, hey, I'm actually activating this muscle correctly. So you'll do high rep, so say 3 sets of 10. Once you get good at it, then I want you to progress to a 5 or 10 second hold. So hold, 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 hold. And the reason I love this exercise so much is because as your glute is being activated, that hip is into extension, but also the other leg is going into hip flexion. So it's important that, yeah, while this is great, while I'm just clenching my butt cheeks, this is more geared towards running, because one leg's in hip flexion, one leg's in hip extension. Trunk is nice and tall, and I'm just squeezing my glute. Hold that contraction, 5 or 10 second hold as you progress. So that is the second exercise to make sure you're activating your glutes correctly. The third exercise to make sure you're activating your glutes correctly is a hip hinge isometric. So what you're going to do, you're going to sit on a chair or a block, and maybe you've heard of good mornings where your arms are crossed and you're hinging forward with that back flat to work on hamstring and glute activation. Well, this is a seated good morning, and then you're gonna lift your butt up. Okay, so from here, I'm gonna hip hinge forward so my back stays flat. Once I feel tension, I'm really trying to push my butt back into that chair and block. Once I feel tension here, I'm going to lift up, hold 5-10 seconds, and come back down. I love this exercise because you're also working on that hamstring lengthening and the glutes while the low back is stabilizing. So this is a great one just to work on that activation. So again, you're hip hinging forward, lift up, and you don't need to squeeze your glutes. They're being activated in that lengthened position, and come back down. So a lot of stability work there, but again, another great exercise to ensure those glutes are being activated correctly. Your next progression of these exercises includes strength training, so squats, deadlifts, single leg deadlifts. If you're finding that your hips are really tight and you're nervous you're not getting into enough hip extension, and therefore your glutes can't function or activate 100% like they should, make sure you check out this hip mobility. Follow along, it'll guide you through all the motions that the hip goes through, and you can compare the left and the right side.